Greetings, folks. We're going to have a look at a sad, tragic, and shocking story involving the murder of two young teenage boys who were killed in Saline County, Arkansas, and their bodies placed on the railroad tracks in an effort to conceal their murders. We're also going to look a little bit into the cover-up of those murders and a few others. For 29 years, justice has been denied to the Ives Greetings, folks. We're going to have a look at a sad, tragic, and shocking story involving the murder of two young teenage boys who were killed in Saline County, Arkansas, and their bodies placed on the railroad tracks in an effort to conceal their murders. We're also going to look a little bit into the cover-up of those murders and a few others. For 29 years, justice has been denied to the Ives and Henry families for the murders of their sons, Kevin and Don. On August 23, 1987, Kevin, then 17, and Don, then 16, were out at night hunting, and sadly would be murdered and their bodies placed on the train tracks where a Union Pacific train would eventually run them over hours later, at approximately 4:25 a.m. Their case would eventually gain national attention in news articles across the country, including the LA Times and the Wall Street Journal, among others, as well as at the time the nationally syndicated television show Unsolved Mysteries, which aired 2 episodes to their case. Another outlet to focus on the murders would be the World of Books, with the best probably being Merrill Everett's Boys on the Tracks, documenting the case of Kevin and Don's murders and the cover-up in extreme detail. The investigation was bungled right from the get-go, and eventually officials from all 3 levels of federal, state, and local governments have all played a part over the decades in the cover-up of the murders of Kevin and Don. It's known who was involved in the murders. There were witnesses to the events that night on record that have passed polygraphs. There was even a confession letter from one of the participants to the murders. So what's the problem? Why can't the Ives and Henry families not get justice for the murders of their sons, Kevin and Don? The probable reason there has been no justice for Kevin and Don's murders is because of why they were murdered. Answering that question leads to even more crimes committed by government agencies. Kevin and Don were killed because they had stumbled onto a drug drop that hot summer night on the very same train tracks where their bodies would be later placed. We have multiple witness testimony to that. That drug drop was part of a secret operation first being run by the late infamous cocaine smuggler Barry Seal, and was one of the facets of the Iran-Contra operations that was never revealed to the American public. It's likely the why the cover-up of Kevin and Don's murders happened, and it began immediately into the investigation and would continue throughout the years, resulting in 10 different local, state, and federal investigations, grand juries, etc., all bearing down on different locations in Arkansas, including Saline and surrounding counties, and the Mena airport as well, all being shut down before any final word would be allowed into the public record. For Kevin and Don, we're going to look at what we do have in the way of evidence and show who we do know was involved in their murders. Hints that a cover-up started immediately in the investigation after their bodies were found. Despite the evidence to the contrary, local officials were immediately treating the case as an accident, while at the same time concealing or denying evidence such as a green tarp that the boys' bodies were covered with, or the rifle that they had with them at the time. The investigation was so shoddy that they even left behind Kevin's foot on the train tracks, which wasn't discovered until 2 days later. Despite all the bungling right off the bat, Saline County Sheriff Jim Steed would proclaim he was pleased with the thorough investigation after those same 2 days. Let's meet Fahmy Malek. He was the state medical examiner in Arkansas at the time of the boys' murders and did the autopsy. After the autopsy, Malek ruled that Kevin and Don had smoked 20 pot joints and fell asleep on the tracks, and thus didn't hear the train blowing its whistle as it was bearing down on them. Now, anybody who knows anything about smoking pot knows that's just a ridiculous ruling. Of course, the Ives and Henry families fought that ruling, and a grand jury was formed, and a second autopsy was ordered. Enter pathologist Joseph Burton of Atlanta, who was brought in and would find that Kevin had been beaten in the head with the butt end of a rifle, and Don had been stabbed in the back, both prior to being placed on the tracks, which would explain the thickness of their blood at the time of their deaths, as witnessed by the train's engineers and emergency first responders to the scene. This clip from the movie Obstruction of Justice better explains the Fahmy Malek story and more of his controversial rulings.
17-year-old Kevin Ives and 16-year-old Don Henry were struck by a train near Alexander. The medical examiner has said that the boys were asleep and drugged with marijuana. The parents, however, disputed that claim and persuaded authorities to reopen the case.
Because of their persistence, Kevin and Don's bodies were exhumed. New autopsies were performed, and a grand jury was convened. Dr. Joseph Burton, a nationally recognized forensic pathologist from out of state, performed the new autopsies. His findings revealed that Don Henry had been stabbed in the back, and Kevin Ives' face had been smashed by a blow from a rifle butt before their bodies were placed on the railroad tracks.
This information alone would strongly suggest that the boys were injured, rendered unconscious, or even killed prior to their bodies being run over by the train.
Burton's autopsies also revealed that Malik had mutilated Kevin's skull by sawing it in so many different directions that it was impossible to tell where the original skull fractures were. Malik also had completely dismantled Kevin's jawbones. Burton stated he had performed thousands of autopsies and had never seen anything like it. Was Malik trying to hide something?
Was there a stab? The answer is no, they were not stabbed. Were they dead beforehand? Absolutely no, they were alive.
A former employee at the crime lab has said he discovered what appeared to be evidence of a stab wound during the original autopsy, but was told, quote, not to worry about it. Malik has refused all comment.
The deaths of these two boys most probably were not accidental deaths, but that they met their death as a result of injuries inflicted on them by other people or another person.
In addition to Burton, 2 other forensic pathologists and 7 forensic investigators with more than 100 years accumulated experience investigating homicides reviewed the case. It was their collective opinion that the ruling be changed to murder.
During the midst of all of the turmoil with trying to get the ruling changed in our case, it became very apparent that this was not an isolated instance of an error in the ruling on the manner of death. There were many other cases statewide that we became aware of.
In 1992, the Los Angeles Times tallied more than 20 additional cases where Dr. Malik had falsified evidence and ruled incorrectly. One case involved the murder of Raymond Albright, who had been shot 5 times in the chest with a Colt 45. Incredibly, Malik had ruled suicide. Another involved James Dewey Milam, whose body was found without the head. In this case, Malik ruled the cause of death to be an ulcer. Although Milam's head had been clearly severed with a knife, Malik claimed the family pooch had bitten off the head, eaten the entire thing, and then regurgitated. Malik says he tested the dog's vomit and found traces of Milam's brain and skull. Unfortunately for Dr. Malik, Milam's head was later found. Malik, it turns out, had made up the entire story. Media coverage of Malik's dishonest rulings resulted in a massive public outcry, calling for his removal from office.
The medical examiner comes up and he has fabrication to where he has created his own evidence.
This is of a magnitude it could create a national scandal, and if necessary, it will.
I have work to
Dr.
do.
Malik, you know me.
I have work to do.
Yes, and you can say that you are honest. Dr. Malik.
Lying on his autopsy cases, lying in court. And he's not an honest person.
That's why he should be prosecuted.
He should be prosecuted.
Nevertheless, both Governor Clinton and the Arkansas State Medical Examiner Commission Chairman, Jocelyn Elders, who had the power to remove Malik from office, not only insisted he remain, they gave him a raise.
Based on the facts I have, I really feel that Arkansas owes Dr. Malik a great debt and a real apology.
Today, the governor was asked if Malik should resign.
I don't think that's a decision that I should make based on what I now know.
How about that? Jocelyn Alders says the state of Arkansas owes Malik a great debt and a real apology. She must have been on crack, sold to her by her son. More on that in a moment, but seriously. And Bill Clinton follows that up when asked about if Malik should resign with a great response.
I don't think that's a decision that I should make based on what I now know.
Are you kidding me? Malik should have been indicted and sent to prison. Anyways, let's meet Linda Ives, Kevin's mother, and hear what she has to say about Fami Malik's ruling.
We were absolutely puzzled and outraged over the ruling of accidental as a manner of death. We didn't think that the facts supported that ruling, and what we started out to do was just to obtain a second opinion. We met resistance from all fronts, from law enforcement, from the crime lab. We retained an attorney and a private investigator and obtained court orders to get testable samples of everything that they had in order to get a second opinion. And Femi Malik refused to obey the court orders. It didn't matter what Malik did, whether it was perjure himself in court, fabricate evidence in murder trials, call coroners murderers. Clinton defended him by excusing it as being stressed out, overworked, and underpaid. His testimony compromised evidence in a lot of felony cases in Arkansas. And it was very transparent that the end result was that he was given a $14,000 raise. It was an absolute insult to my family.
Read my lips. I'm not going to comment.
Dr. Malik refused repeated requests to talk with us. But when we caught up with him, he said people didn't like him because he's from Egypt. And he claimed he had never made a single mistake in any of the 7,000 autopsies he conducted. People say that as the state medical examiner, you were incompetent and you bungled cases, and that Governor Clinton, for some reason, defended you and protected you. Is that the case?
You have to understand, they did 7,000 autopsies. Not one single case overturned because of me.
Not a single case?
Not one single case.
But that's just not true.
Yet somehow, Malik got a 41% raise for his efforts. On a side note, I'd like to take the time to point out the differences in motherhood. On one hand, we have Linda Ives, who lost her son, and she has the proper mother's love of her child, which has also been what's kept her drive in full gear to continue the fight for justice for her son, Kevin. On the other hand, we have Arkansas State Medical Examiner's Commission Chairman, Jocelyn Elders, Femi Malik's boss, pictured here, who no doubt loves her son, but one must question her overall ethics in supporting Malik. And in an ironic twist, and if you know the overall case well enough, you'll agree it's ironic. Shortly after Bill Clinton, who strongly supported Malik as well, took Elders to the White House with him and appointed Elders United States Surgeon General, her son Kevin will get arrested for selling cocaine to undercover agents and get a 10-year jail sentence. Had Elders been paying more attention to truth and integrity, perhaps she would not only have told the truth about Malik, but might have raised her son in a better manner that would have had him knowing better than to involve cocaine into his life and selling it. Anyways, let's meet Dan Harmon. Dan Harmon is the key player in this whole story. Keep that in mind as we go. He was a former state prosecutor from 1978 to 1980 and had his share of troubles and unreported domestic abuses on multiple ex-wives over the years and was always protected and vouched for by many officials, both law enforcement and civil. And by the time Femi Malik had made his ridiculous ruling, Harmon actually convinced Judge John Cole to appoint himself, Harmon, as special prosecutor in the original grand jury investigation into the boys' murders. Harmon and his best friend and assistant prosecutor, Richard Garrett, approached the Ives family and embraced them as friends, promised them they would find the killers of Kevin and Don. Little did the Ives family know at the time, though, that Dan Harmon himself was actually involved in the murders of Kevin and Don, which in hindsight now makes sense, understanding why Harmon made sure he was appointed to the case. Ultimately, the grand jury investigation into Kevin and Don's murders was closed down on December 31st, 1988 by Judge Cole, working in concert with Harmon and Garrett, and the jurors are not allowed to render any of its findings on record.
The Saline County Special Grand Jury has now disbanded. 3 hours ago, it delivered its final report on the deaths of 2 teenage boys. But the grand jury was not allowed to do what it wanted.
I know that because you could not repeat in the report much of the testimony that you heard and evidence that you received, that you are somewhat frustrated by it. And that's understandable.
In the final analysis, I know that the grand jury hated at this point to give it up, because I think the public needs to know about the seriousness of the drug problem here in Saline County and maybe other surrounding counties.
So even though there was no one charged in the original grand jury investigation, and there was plenty of evidence of many problems and suspicious activity by officials overall, Judge John Cole and prosecutors Dan Harmon and Richard Garrett brought the grand jury to a close on December 31st, 1988, with the grand jury evidence and reports suppressed and not allowed on record, against the grand jury's own wishes. Unreal. And the unreal is only just beginning. A number of witnesses and people with information to Kevin and Don's murders would themselves be killed in the years following the murders of Kevin and Don. All of their murders would go unresolved as well, except for the murder of Keith McCaskill, where they pinned on one of his neighbors who couldn't possibly have done it. McCaskill also reportedly announced to his friends and family in the final days before his own murder that he knew too much about the murders of Kevin and Don, and his days were numbered as well. Coney was a friend of Kevin and Don's and was actually with Kevin and Don on the night they were murdered. It would likely be the last friendly face the poor boys would ever get to see again. It's also interesting to note that both Keith McCaskill and Keith Coney were themselves both killed with their murders unresolved before Judge Cole, Harmon, and Garrett shut down the original grand jury investigation, with no public results permitted from the jury. Another interesting thing to note was that during those investigations, despite what witnesses such as the parents had told officials, they still refused to link the murders of their deaths to Kevin and Don, despite the obvious connections.
I think that Mr. McCaskill was probably suffering from a lot of paranoia. And right now the indications are that nobody else was involved.
Might there have been a reason, though, for his paranoia?
I'm sure there was a reason for his paranoia.
Because he talked to the police or the prosecutor?
I don't know that would be the reason.
What about the murder? Is it connected at all with the grand jury investigation?
Not that we know of.
McCaskill was a witness in the Bryant train deaths investigation. Although police haven't ascertained a motive for the murder, they say there's no connection.
We link this investigation to the deaths of Don Henry or Kevin Ives, and I don't foresee anything in the pursuance of the rest of this investigation that would be anything that would make me change my mind.
Now let's meet Jean Duffy. She's one of the few honest people in this whole sordid affair. In the beginning of 1990, Jean Duffy was appointed to head the newly created 7th Judicial District Drug Task Force that was formed to look into the drug and corruption problems going on in the Saline County area and other surrounding counties as well. There was also a federal investigation looking into Saline and surrounding counties for drugs and corruptions amongst officials being run at the same time by U.S. Attorneys Chuck Banks and his assistant Bob Govar. The deeper Duffy and her team of investigators got, the more Dan Harmon through the media was trying to discredit her. Though she had no way to know it at the time, but immediately on Duffy's first day on the job as head of the task force, she was told not to look into anything involving government officials by her immediate supervisor, Gary Arnold.
Gary Arnold came into my office, stood in front of my desk, looked me straight in the face, and said, "Jean, you are not to use the drug task force to investigate any public official." He turned on his heel and marched out. Now, as startling as that statement might sound, I really didn't think that it was going to pose any kind of problem because at that time, I didn't have any indication that there was any public official in our judicial district who was involved in drugs.
Let's have a look at some of what Jean Duffy discovered.
I established a drug task force, set it up, hired undercover officers, learned what I could to help the district get on its feet with investigation of drug activities in the district.
Instantly, one of her investigators reveals that the now infamous train deaths may be tied to a major drug smuggling ring operating out of Mena.
There were people who had been turning up dead who were possible witnesses in the train deaths case. I respected my undercover officer's instincts about the case, and I certainly gave him permission to go forward with an investigation. He said that there were drug drops coming from airplanes in that area, in the exact vicinity where Kevin and Don had been murdered. And these drug drops from airplanes had virtually not been investigated by any of the law enforcement agencies in our district. And the connections that we made almost immediately led to several public officials. And the person whose name came up immediately and most frequently was Dan Harmon.
3 years had passed since the boys had been killed. and Jean had no way of knowing that her drug task force was about to be shut down for nearly solving Kevin and Don's murders.
It didn't occur to me that it was appropriate for our drug task force to reopen the case of the boys on the track until one of my undercover officers came to me and told me that not only was the case drug-related, but it was also solvable. He asked permission to investigate, and I agreed to that and told him that we would take our information then to Bob Govar.
Ironically, Dan Harmon and Richard Garrett, the very same men who had conducted the grand jury investigation of Kevin and Don's murders, were two of the main targets of Govar's drug and corruption investigation. Linda Ives, who for years had believed Harmon and Garrett were sincerely trying to solve her son's murder, now realized they were the ones orchestrating the cover-up.
We certainly don't have any suspects at this point in time. It's been quite a while, and I really didn't anticipate that it would take this long when we first started. I'm frustrated in the amount of time that it's taken. Frustrated that we weren't able to accomplish some things we probably should have been able to. Whatever comes out of it, if someone's charged or not charged, the grand jury has done a tremendous job.
But it still will leave the open question where, if the boys were murdered, who did it?
Well, until it's solved, that's correct.
To make matters worse, Harmon suddenly became the prosecutor-elect for a 3-county district, which included Saline County. Harmon, who had friends in the Arkansas press, wasted no time in launching a massive media smear campaign against Jean Duffy.
He immediately began a media crusade against me.
Eventually, Jean Duffy's name would be so completely smeared in a public campaign led by Dan Harmon through the media, who printed everything he told them, with no evidence, and combined with a statewide subpoena issued for Duffy and her task force's evidence to appear before Judge John Cole, the same judge who appointed Harmon as a special prosecutor of the original grand jury investigation, and who also closed that grand jury without letting the jurors enter their findings into the public record. Well, Duffy was wise, and she left the state and became a school teacher in Texas until her name could be later cleared by the FBI. Initially, when leaving, she figured the evidence she gave to Bob Govar and Chuck Banks in their federal investigation would bring indictments to Harmon and others, and her name would be cleared then. Little did she know at the time, though, that U.S. Attorney Chuck Banks would shut down the investigation in June of 1991 and clear Harmon and all officials of any wrongdoing. Meet saline detective John Brown, who enters the story in 1993, and, like Jean Duffy before him, would also be warned off looking into the murders of Kevin and Don.
It was now 5.5 years since Kevin and Don's murders. Detective John Brown, a 16-year law enforcement veteran, had moved his family into the Saline County area. The Ives family had asked the new sheriff to reopen the case, and John was given the assignment. However, just like Jean Duffy, John's first day on the job included a peculiar request from his boss.
My immediate supervisor, who was a lieutenant of the Saline County Criminal Investigation Division, took me for a ride that lasted approximately 1 hour. During this ride to literally nowhere, it appeared the whole purpose was to tell me to leave the case alone. He said things like, there's not anything to this. This could have been an accident. It's going to bring you a lot of grief if you continue on and do this. And in the end, he finally said, John, you really need to leave this alone.
John was disturbed by his superior's attitude, and his concern escalated once he began examining the Ives Henry case file.
It became obvious that once I started going through the case file, it had been robbed of most of the pertinent evidence. No crime scene photographs, a list of evidence was not present, the things you would expect to find.
Here's an FBI document from a later investigation in the mid-1990s showing that there was indeed evidence missing from the case files, which states, quote, evidence from this case to include a sketch of the accident scene, cigarette butts left at the accident site, pictures of the crime scene, plus the original case files are missing, end quote. Also from this FBI document we can see, quote, Saline County officials are baffled that some of the original evidence collected during 1987 is no longer available and that files are missing, end quote.
I run across a young lady named Charlene Wilson, who told a horror story that I didn't really believe at the time. So I started searching for evidence to substantiate just part of what she had said. Herman went ballistic. He called, he threatened me, threatened Sheriff Pridgeon, threatened Captain Gene Donham, the chief deputy. All because I talked to this one woman.
To date, a total of 9 separate state and federal investigations into Mina have been shut down.
The first indication I had that Mina made tired of the death of these 2 kids was through an audio tape provided to me by Russell Welch, an Arkansas State Police investigator assigned to Mina. The tape was of a confidential informant inside the Federal Corrections Facility. That tape would allege that Don Henry and Kevin Ives were killed because of a connection to Mina, Arkansas. An actual report was generated by Saline County Sheriff's Office in 1987 and in 88 of people complaining of the planes flying over the tracks at approximately 100 feet above ground level with their lights out at night. I have interviewed 5 pilots, 4 of which can verify the A-12 location being the tracks just west of Little Rock, Arkansas, where these 2 kids' bodies were found.
So just like Gene Duffy before him, John Brown was up against a mountain of resistance when it came to the investigation of both Mina and the deaths of Kevin and Don, and was also on the receiving end of threats from Dan Harmon, just like Gene Duffy was, especially when it came to the topic of the deaths of the boys and Charlene Wilson. John Brown would eventually retire from the force after a couple of years from fear of what his investigation uncovered. So let's go back to Dan Harmon, who by June 1990 became the 7th Judicial District Prosecutor-elect, and after running Gene Duffy out of town and dealing with Detective John Brown forcing his early retirement, Harmon eventually put his buddy Roger Walls in charge of a new task force, which is the same position once held by Duffy. So you gotta figure this will turn out good, right? Well, no. Dan Harmon's nefarious ways would finally catch up to him in the mid-1990s, and by 1996 he was arrested, and by July 1997 he was convicted on several felonies including drug charges and racketeering. Unfortunately, the investigation was limited to the crimes he committed only after his election to prosecutor in 1990, or somewhere around there. And they were not allowed to look into anything on Harmon from the 1980s, or any of Gene Duffy's or John Brown's investigations into the train theft cases. His buddy Roger Walls would be convicted in January of 1998 on conspiracy charges related to Harmon's case. He was let off a bunch of charges, including drug-related charges, when Bill Clinton appointed U.S. Attorney Paula Casey intervened, but Walls would ultimately receive 28 months for conspiracy to extort nonetheless. Harmon and Walls appealed their convictions in 1999 and lost. After getting out of jail, Dan Harmon would again get arrested in connection with drugs in 2010.
It is tonight's top story. Police say the 6-month investigation that landed Harmon behind bars also led to the arrest of a dozen other people in Grant County. Police say it's a drug operation ranging from cocaine to painkillers. THV's Faith Abube joins us now with more. Faith?
Hi, Liz. Police say Harmon was illegally selling prescription drugs near Sheridan School. While there's no evidence linking him and the 12 other suspects, police say they are all part of an ongoing drugs team.
Anybody who sells drugs is a threat to the public.
Former Saline County Prosecutor Dan Harmon is back behind bars, barely 4 years after serving time for extortion, racketeering, and drug conspiracy from a 1997 conviction.
If he thinks that he's going to be able to do it because of his status as being a former prosecutor, he's wrong. It's not going to happen here.
Harmon is among the last few alleged drug dealers taken off Sheridan streets after a 6-month investigation. Harmon lives in Saline County, but the investigation led police here to a traffic stop. Police say they found several drug items in his car. Harmon's passenger, a well-known drug dealer, is also now helping authorities.
Anytime you're dealing with narcotics and dealing with this type of criminal element, it can be dangerous and get dangerous at any time.
Assistant Chief Brent Cole says the former prosecutor is facing several felony charges that could land him in prison, this time for life.
I think it's sad, the man was a prosecutor. He used to prosecute people for the same crimes that he's committed.
Police are not releasing any information or photographs of the 12 other suspects, but they also face serious charges. Cole says for a small community the size of Sheridan, he hopes the sting sends a message to offenders still out there.
It don't matter who you are, we're going to come after you.
Even though police say Harmon was selling the drugs near school, they don't believe he sold them to any young kids. He's still behind bars tonight on a $100,000 bond. Liz?
All right, Faith, thank you. Harmon served one term as Saline County prosecutor in 1979. Voters elected him again in the 90s for 2 terms. He resigned after his 1996 arrest. He got out of prison early in 2006 for helping prosecutors in a murder case.
So after understanding that Dan Harmon actually is a piece of work, and involved heavily in cocaine and marijuana distribution, we can look back at both the investigations of Gene Duffy and John Brown with a fresh eye towards what the actual truth is. And that truth is startling. One of the witnesses in common in both Duffy's and Brown's investigations was Charlene Wilson, who Dan Harmon aggressively tried blocking any contact from her to both Duffy and Brown, though both investigators dealt plenty with Wilson anyways. Duffy even vouches for Wilson in as far as saying that her testimony in the matter is true and accurate. What was it about Wilson that got Harmon so up in anger when investigators into the deaths of the boys would start questioning her? First, let's go to Gene Duffy again and get her opinion on Charlene Wilson as a witness to her investigation.
Charlene was recommended to our task force as an informant from DEA, who had used her as an informant, and also from at least 2 other law enforcement agencies that had used her as an informant and said that she was reliable. I used Charlene, and she proved to be very, very reliable. There was not one bit of information that she ever gave me that didn't pan out.
So now, let's hear what Charlene Wilson has to say.
The people at the track that night, to my knowledge, were Dan Harmon, Keith McCaskill, Larry Rochelle. I do know that the boys were watching the drop site, okay? And they got curious as to what was being dropped there.
Wow, that's some pretty explosive stuff right there. Wilson admits to being there that night on the tracks, and names Dan Harmon as one of the people being there as well, and also mentions the drug drop as the reason as to why they were being there to begin with. Gene Duffy completely backs her on this. You know what? Wilson's not the only one naming Dan Harmon as being on the tracks that night.
Linda Ives turned this witness over to a local investigator who took him to the FBI. The FBI immediately put this witness into protective custody, gave him a polygraph test, which he passed, and opened their investigation.
Where we didn't realize there was anybody else out there at first. We were, just like I said, goofing off. We come up on, or didn't really come up on, we noticed there were people on the track. Saw a flashlight come on and then go back off. They weren't looking in our direction, but we could see the light. And so we kind of quieted down and snuck up a little bit closer to see what was going on. And there was 5 individuals standing on the tracks. One thing that struck my curiosity is, at the time my mother was dating an attorney named Dan Harmon. I knew him well enough to recognize him. There were 2 more individuals that a few minutes after we got there were walking down the railroad tracks that had a rifle and what looked to be a flashlight. And they were more or less kind of minding their own business. And when they realized someone else was on the tracks, they stopped and was fixing to turn around when someone or Danny motioned for them to come closer over to where they were. They hesitated and eventually ended up walking on towards the rest of the group. While my head was turned, I heard what sounded like a gunshot. I saw a flash, as you would expect with a gunshot at night. We were pretty much terrified and bolted and ran.
Other witnesses corroborated that evidence.
I know that Dan Harmon went down there because I was down the road from there. It's in an automobile. I do know that a drop was made. I've absolutely 100% unequivocally made there that night.
And there you have it. Both witnesses, independently of each other, who don't know each other, who both passed polygraphs, named Dan Harmon as being on the train tracks that night and involved in the murders of the boys.
The people at the track that night, to my knowledge, were Dan Harmon, Keith McCaskill, Larry Rochelle.
like to point out that Gene Duffy, by 1994 cleared by the FBI of any and all of the charges made up by Dan Harmon and Judge Cole, came back to help the FBI with their investigation into the murders of Kevin and Don, being run by the FBI's Phyllis Cornyn. Here's Gene Duffy again with some hindsight looking back on things in the mid-90s.
So in June of 1990, Dan Harmon became the district's prosecutor-elect. The first news conference or news interview that he gave, he used the entire interview to begin to discredit me. After working with the FBI for 18 months, beginning in March of 1995, of course, now I realize what was the basis for Dan Harmon's viciousness against me and determination that I be not allowed to do my job. I now know that Dan Harmon was on the tracks with the boys the night that they were murdered. I look back on the chain of events and realize that I likely caused the shutdown of my own investigation. It's clear to me that the turning point was when I gave Chuck Banks the information developed by my task force that the boys were killed because they had stumbled upon a large shipment of drugs dropped from an airplane. In my heart, I feel that that was a red flag that caused Chuck Banks to close the investigation down before it led to Mina.
And that's not all. For nearly 23 years, this confession letter that the Ives and Henry families were told nothing about, written and signed by Charlene Wilson on May 28, 1993, in front of 3 public officials to bear witness, was left hidden in the original case files. Only just last year in 2015 did a retired police officer friend of Linda Ives manage to find it and get it to her and her lawyer, R. David Lewis. Linda and her friend went to current Saline County prosecutor Ken Cassidy with the confession letter, and he not only refused to even look at it, he told them to go see the Saline County Sheriff with the matter. Guess who the current Saline County Sheriff is? Rodney Wright, who just so happens to be Dan Harmon's nephew. Can you believe that? So current Saline County prosecutor Ken Cassidy told Linda Ives and her retired police officer friend to take the Charlene Wilson confession letter that places Dan Harmon on the tracks the night of the murders to Dan Harmon's nephew. It's no wonder the boys' murders have never been officially solved. There's a whole list of former law enforcement members and public officials who were involved in the boys' case over the decades who have gone on to be arrested. In the letter, Wilson confesses to a great many of things, including stabbing one of the boys. So now there's 2 witnesses in Charlene Wilson and Tom Nyhouse who, independently of each other and past polygraphs, both identify and place Dan Harmon on the tracks that August night where Kevin and Don were killed. And there's the confession letter from Charlene Wilson that also places Dan Harmon on the tracks that night and includes her admission that she stabbed one of the boys, likely the stab wound found on Don Henry's back that was found in the second autopsy performed by Dr. Burton. And to further the point, we see Dan Harmon finally getting caught after years of nefarious activities and going to jail for 9 years. And within 2 years of being released, he gets arrested again and yet more drug charges. Could there be more? What else is there? How about this? An FBI file dated February 6, 1995, and in it, it states in part, quote, "Further, it appears that the special prosecutor appointed in this case, redacted," it says Dan Harmon under that redaction, "may have misused his authority and disregarded other leads that may have assisted efforts to bring this investigation to a logical conclusion. Lastly, it also appears that certain Saline County officials may have conspired to cover up the investigation in the deaths of Don Henry and Kevin Ives." End quote. Here's an FBI document showing that Dan Harmon himself indeed pushed to be appointed special prosecutor right from the beginning. It states, quote, "Little Rock FBI investigation reveals that Benton Chief of Police Rick Elmendorf, Judge John Cole, and Dan Harmon were at Judge Cole's residence when Dan Harmon suggested that he be made special prosecutor for the Ives Henry case." End quote. The document also states, quote, "Since the beginning of the investigation by the special prosecutor, the case has become riddled with rumors and innuendos. Special Prosecutor Harmon and Assistant Richard Garrett requested assistance from the Arkansas State Police, yet continuously withheld information from them." End quote. So Harmon and Garrett would ask assistance from the Arkansas State Police, but they would withhold information from them, which is what someone who is guilty might do if they were trying to find out what other authorities knew about the case, and to keep ahead of any potential damage. as well as not let any information out that might reveal one's true participation in a crime. So there you go. In the mid-1990s, the FBI knew there was a cover-up in the murders of Kevin Ives and Don Henry, and they also knew Dan Harmon was likely involved. As a matter of fact, there's a whole pile of FBI and other government documents that are partially redacted in some form or another relating to the murder of the two boys. We'll get to them in a moment. First, I'm going to try and piece together what happened that night from what we do know about this case, which also includes information from witness testimony given by others that we have not documented in this film yet. We know that Kevin and Don went out around midnight to go hunting. And thanks to Charlene Wilson's confession letter recently unearthed in 2015, we know that her, Dan Harmon, and another individual named Larry Rochelle were going to be at the tracks that night to pick up a drug drop from a plane. Kevin and Don were walking along the tracks and happened to come across Dan Harmon and company on the tracks, as witnessed by a then 12-year-old Tom Nyhouse and his group of friends who were hiding in the nearby bushes watching. A shot was fired either by Harmon's group or the boys, and Kevin and Don took off, as did Nyhouse and the group of other kids that witnessed those events. Next, we have two separate witnesses who gave testimony, one being Ronnie Godwin, now deceased, and the other being club owner Mike Crook, who was relaying testimony of what another witness described to him about the following events, and neither knew each other, and both were telling the same story. They were saying that the boys showed up at the Ranch Egg grocery store with another friend of theirs, Keith Coney, and this would be sometime after the first incident on the tracks. And Coney then left on his motorcycle when officers Kirk Lane and Jay Campbell showed up and beat the boys unconscious outside the store, probably killing Kevin right there with the reported rifle butt blow to the skull, which showed up in Dr. Burton's second autopsy. Then Campbell and Lane threw the boys into the car and drove off towards the tracks, where Dan Harmon and the others were waiting, and would eventually place the boys on the tracks. Keith Coney, who may have been with the group of kids in the woods that first saw the incident happen at the tracks, went to the club where Keith McCaskill worked and told him about the incident on the tracks. And McCaskill then went to the tracks himself, which makes sense as well, as Charlene Wilson is named McCaskill as one of the people at the tracks by the time she leaves the car that's parked some distance away and reaches the tracks where Dan Harmon, Danny Allen, Keith McCaskill, and others are alleged to be. Wilson doesn't mention Campbell and Lane as being on the tracks in the confession letter, and it's possible that they were first tasked to find the boys after they took off from the tracks, and when Campbell and Lane found them at the Ranch Egg grocery store, and after beating them unconscious, they perhaps brought them back to the tracks where Harmon and the others were waiting, and they themselves left the scene, leaving Harmon and the others to place the boys on the tracks for the upcoming train. Also of note, as mentioned earlier, is that Keith Coney would soon be killed as well, one of the number of witnesses killed in the months and years following the murders of Kevin and Don. Here's Keith Coney's mother describing that her son knew there were two attackers that killed Kevin and Don, allegedly Jay Campbell and Kirk Lane, as testified to by Ronnie Godwin and Mike Crook, and saying that her son Keith, like Keith McCaskill later would be, was afraid for his life.
He was fearing for his life, a couple of months before. He said a couple of times that he knew people, that he was being watched, and he was afraid.
Mrs. Alexander says her son knew the two teenagers run over by the train, and she says he indicated to her he had been there when the boys had died, that he spotted two attackers.
But he knew there was two there. I did try to get him to tell me who, and he was either afraid or didn't know.
In the movie Obstruction of Justice, which many of these clips are taken from, they present a list of names of people who are suspects and implicated in the murders and cover-up of Kevin and Don. As a result, officers Jay Campbell and Kirk Lane sued filmmaker Pat Matriciana for libel and lost their case on appeal. The interesting part about that case is that Campbell and Lane were required to prove that Matriciana was wrong in naming them as suspects by showing there was no public references to them as being involved in the murders. Campbell and Lane instead set out to prove that they had nothing to do with and were innocent in the murders. The court sided with Matriciana, and that there were in fact numerous public sources that had stated Campbell and Lane were somehow involved in the train deaths, and Matriciana had not just made it up unfounded. That was the point of the suit, and the fact that Campbell and Lane instead tried to prove their innocence, and the court still didn't rule in their favor, certainly says a few more things in my opinion. That makes it two witnesses naming and describing Campbell and Lane as beating the boys unconscious and throwing them in the cars, and another witness in Keith Coney that says he was there when the two boys were killed and it was two men that did it. Charlene Wilson doesn't mention Campbell and Lane in her confession letter, but she does say she spent the first portion of time that night back at the car at the road, a dirt road, a distance away, before coming up to the tracks herself. It's entirely possible and very plausible that Campbell and Lane dropped off Kevin and Don to Dan Harmon and company and then left. Wilson's confession letter is hard to read and very incoherent, but she does say she was high on cocaine and meth that night, which kind of explains the way she describes the night's events. When Charlene Wilson eventually does make her way to the tracks, according to her confession letter, the boys are already there and, in her written words, deceased. And she states that Dan Harmon and company goaded her into stabbing one of the boys, which was probably Don Henry. According to the FBI, law enforcement officials were indeed involved in the murders and cover-up of Kevin and Don. From this document, we can see that the, quote, investigation has revealed that law enforcement officials in the Little Rock area may have been involved in the captioned homicide, end quote. Here's a list of suspected officials we're not allowed to know about. It says, quote, law enforcement officials alleged to be involved in drug trafficking in Saline County include, end quote. That's a big list, all redacted. How can it be that so many officials have been corrupted over such a long period of time? Remember how the current Saline Sheriff, Rodney Wright, just so happens to be Dan Harmon's nephew? So what about the sheriff before him? Well, in 2012, then Saline County Sheriff Bruce Pennington said the case remained open, and the investigation is continuing. From the same article in the Saline Courier, it says that Detective Mike Frost is the only one assigned to the case. Here's Detective Mike Frost, who was the lone officer assigned to Kevin and Don's case back in 2012.
August 3rd, 1987, and a horrific discovery right on the border of Alexander and Saline County.
Anytime you're dealing with a homicide that has any type of drug ties to it, you always run into those problems where you got a lot of different stories.
A train traveling 50 miles an hour. The conductor sees something on the track just ahead. Unable to stop, the train runs over two people covered by a tarp. 17-year-old Kevin Ives and 16-year-old Don Henry dragged nearly a mile. The first autopsy deems it a suicide. Their bodies exhumed 1 year later. The case turns to a homicide.
I have several people that said they were in the woods. We have no one that has said that they were at the scene.
Lieutenant Mike Frost, head of Saline County's Criminal Investigation Division, now leads the investigation.
There are not a whole lot of leads, new leads that come in. I do not have a detective assigned to the case. I am the one who goes through the case. I've been through the case files and try to follow up on things that I can find in the case file from that time frame.
Lieutenant Frost says the case has been met with numerous challenges. He says the biggest, perhaps, speculation.
It really makes it difficult to get a handle on exactly what happened on the case.
On top of speculation are claims of a government cover-up.
No, there has not been. As long as I have been in the sheriff's office or have been in the criminal investigation division.
Some suggest the boys saw an aircraft drop with money and drugs tied to an alleged drug ring based out of Mena involving government officials.
There's nothing that I can see that has tied Mena to this case. That's not saying that it wasn't.
Lieutenant Frost says witnesses withhold information out of fear for their lives. Key evidence, crucial, like crime scene pictures and the entire grand jury testimony, all missing from the file. Also, he says several potential witnesses are now deceased.
So many of the people who were as witnesses have since passed. And like I said, a lot of people can say a lot of people were murdered, which they may have been. There are a lot of people who died of natural causes.
But Lieutenant Frost maintains the case is solvable. It just takes finding the right person with the right information.
When I know of one individual that I would love to be able to talk to that has been missing for many years, that very well may be tied into it, but he has never been found.
Daniel Wilkerson for today's THV.
So Mike Frost says they have no one who says they were at the scene. I can only imagine he's using a play on words, as witness Tom Nyhouse, who saw Kevin and Don at the tracks at the same time as Dan Harmon, has stated such, but sadly is now deceased, like so many others in this case. But Charlene Wilson is still alive. She also says she was at the scene. She even wrote and signed a confession letter to that effect. Both Nyhouse and Wilson's testimony contradict what Detective Mike Frost is saying. Frost also says he's gone through the case files. So how did he miss Charlene Wilson's confession letter? While I cannot definitively answer that question, we can see a pattern in what follows in his own arrest and conviction along with his boss and former Saline sheriff at the time, Bruce Pennington. So the guys investigating in 2012 end up going to jail themselves, which only shows how much effort they probably put in towards trying to solve the case. So it should be asked again, how can it be that so many officials have been corrupted over such a long period of time? I've found that the deeper you look into the politics of Arkansas in general, You end up coming back having more questions than answers. Former and now deceased, I believe as well, Officer Danny Allen of the Saline County Sheriff's Office, from what I can gather, is allegedly one of the people that was at the tracks that night at some point. Here's an FBI document talking about Allen's polygraph results. Quote, Allen, which is redacted, indicated strong deception regarding knowledge of who killed the boys as well as who put the boys on the tracks. End quote. That statement right there makes perfect sense, and why I say it's key to understanding part of what happened that night, and understanding that it was two different parties involved in the murders of Kevin and Don. Allen not only knew who killed the boys, but also who put them on the tracks. It's right there in the wording that Allen knew who killed them, and quote, as well as, end quote, who put them on the tracks. Had it have only been a single person or one party doing the deed, the statement would have read something like, quote, Allen indicated strong deception regarding knowledge of who killed and put the boys on the tracks, end quote. That would have indicated only one party or person involved. The fact that the FBI stated that Allen's polygraph indicated strong deception and he knew who killed the boys as well as who put them on the tracks is very direct and indicative of at least two different and separate parties involved. And that makes perfect sense when you consider the two different witnesses stating that Jay Campbell and Kirk Lane beat the boys unconscious at the grocery store and threw them into the back of the unmarked cruiser and drove off towards the tracks. Also in the statement it says, quote, Redacted did advise Special Agent Redacted that he believes, and I'm going to speculate here that the redacted name that is under that long blacked out line says Special Prosecutor Dan Harmon, to be involved in the death of the boys, end quote. Of course, that part is speculative, but I feel safe in that presumption. Here's an Arkansas State Police document detailing Mike Crook's statement about Jay Campbell and Kirk Lane, who, quote, beat the boys unconscious and threw them into the back of the car and then drove off, end quote. Which is the same story corroborated by another witness, Ronnie Godwin. Also of note in that report is, quote, Crook states that before Keith McCaskill was killed, McCaskill told him that Kirk Lane and Jay Campbell of the Pulaski County Sheriff's Office were following him around, and he was afraid they were going to kill him, end quote. Stuff he told his friends and family as well. And McCaskill was indeed murdered, stabbed over 100 times in his garage with blood all over the scene reminiscent of the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Most of his flesh had been shredded from his arm in his apparent fight to stave off his attackers. By all accounts, McCaskill was a big man and had a reputation as a guy who could handle himself in rough situations with no problems. His murder was pinned on McCaskill's neighbor, a 140-pound 19-year-old kid named Ronald Shane Smith, with an IQ of 81. McCaskill was killed in his garage on November 10, 1988, which was the month before the grand jury into Kevin and Don's murders would be closed down. McCaskill was found by his friends the same day of his murder, and while the police were investigating, Shane Smith's father, Ronald Smith, walked over and told the police that his son Shane had witnessed the murder. Apparently, Shane Smith saw several men enter McCaskill's garage, and he went over and was jumped by them, who had allegedly stabbed his hand and told him to keep quiet. They had allegedly handed Smith a silver tray with a paper bag containing videotapes and told him to leave, and Smith allegedly slipped and fell on blood as he left. Smith states that he had blood on his clothes from that and that he put them in a bag and threw them into the river. The police searched the river and found the bag of clothes and also found the bag of tapes and silver tray on the Smith family residence next door to McCaskill's. Smith's story changed from one of 3 men entering McCaskill's garage wearing clown masks to 5 men entering the garage wearing black masks. At his trial, Smith's explanation for the variances in his account, he said, was because he was scared and confused. I'm not sure how or why they convicted Smith, but he did appeal his case on several counts, a couple of times. And I won't go into it all here, but you can pause and read it for yourself if you like. But I would like to point out that we also have some familiar figures in this case as well, in Judge John Cole, Richard Garrett, and Fahmy Malik again. So right off the bat, that should sound some alarm bells about this case. But again, in looking back to Jay Campbell and Kirk Lane, from the ID Files website, an excellent website done by Linda Ives and Gene Duffy, we can see that there was an Arkansas State Police report interview with Joseph Clark Farmer, who was a friend of Eugene Coney, Keith Coney's father. And remember, Keith Coney is the boy that was with Kevin and Don the night they were murdered, and would himself be killed not too long after. And he claimed he saw it was 2 men that killed Kevin and Don, but that's all he would tell his mother. So according to the State Police interview with Joseph Farmer, Eugene Coney told him, quote, Keith said that the cops killed the boys, end quote. So apparently Keith Coney, who wouldn't or couldn't identify the two men he saw kill Kevin and Don to his mother, told his father, Eugene Coney, that it was the police that killed them, which fits in with the story that witness Ronnie Godwin was saying, which was the same story being told by Mike Crook's account of another witness who doesn't know Godwin. Just a quick note about the ID Files website. The URL is www.idfiles.com. The I is for Ives and the D is for Duffy. It's chock full of information about the case, but seems to have stopped being updated in the late 1990s. Now, I don't know if this has anything to do with it, but in 1998, the webmaster who was running the site for Linda Ives and Gene Duffy started getting death threats from Thailand, of all places. Of course, people in Thailand didn't likely care about the truth of what happened to two young boys 11 years earlier in Saline County, Arkansas. It's more likely that the death threats were sent via proxy server, or whatever version of one was back in 1998, that was routed through Thailand. At any rate, with the amount of people involved in this case that have been killed, perhaps this is why the site stopped updating? I don't know. Remember when I said earlier about the unreal is only just beginning? Do you believe me now? As I said before, there are a whole host of documents from many of the government's alphabet agencies, such as the FBI, CIA, DEA, and so on, pertaining to the murder of Kevin and Don. All the conclusions point to the conspiracy by law enforcement officials to cover it all up, which is exactly what has happened ever since. It's a pretty incredible read when you put it all together. The end result of the FBI investigation in the mid-1990s was for the FBI to inform Linda Ives that, quote, a crime has not been committed, quote. What? After all that, they tell her no crime has been committed? What happened was that when the FBI's Phyllis Cornyn's mid-1990s investigation into Kevin and Don's murders started to point towards the clandestine operations at Mena Airport as to the reason why they were killed, her investigation, like the many investigations before it, was brought to a halt, and that's where it was left. As we can see, as no one right on up to Sheriff Bruce Pennington and Detective Mike Frost, and current Prosecutor Ken Cassidy and Sheriff Rodney Wright have not done anything to bring this case to justice. No justice for Kevin and Don. Let's hear from Linda Ives.
There aren't any words in the English language that can describe how it makes you feel as a parent or as a citizen of Arkansas to see what our officials are capable of doing. I think we were just kind of naive, common, ordinary people. Got up and went to work every day and came home and went to bed and assumed that everybody else did the same thing and tried to do what was right. And I think Kevin's death has been the rudest awakening that anybody could ever have to see what really goes on and to see what's important to elected and public officials. This is not a political issue with me. We were never a political family. Our lives revolved around the ball field and going to the lake and all of the things that a family does until the Arkansas political machine reached into our lives and destroyed the tranquility that we had. And I want the American people to know that we have to stand up against this kind of corruption, and we have to hold our officials accountable and make them work for us instead of against us. In my experience, I believe what is happening here in Arkansas is only a small sample as to what is happening nationwide, and I believe that all of America has to stand up and rescue the American system of justice.
Rescue the American system of justice, indeed. Kevin's mother, Linda Ives, is the whole reason we know so much about this case. She knew right from day one that something was not right, and authorities were not doing what they should have been doing. It's because of her relentless pursuit of the truth that we have so many documents, news articles, television shows, movies, books, and so on, that document the injustice brought upon not only hers and the Henry families, but the many other families who have lost loved ones in the cover-up of the murders of Kevin and Don. I'm the same age as Kevin would have been. His mother Linda's tenacity and dedication reminds me of my own mother's love and dedication, and if it had been me in Kevin's place all those years ago, I know my own mom would have put up the same fight with the same determination that Linda Ives has had the strength to do in the decades since Kevin's murder. This is a big part of what drove me to do this. Linda Ives made a promise to Kevin that day that she would fight until the killers were brought to justice. Not that it would have mattered, but keep in mind that when she began the fight for justice, she had no idea that it would be a fight against the official agencies that are meant to protect us. But Linda Ives has made good on her word and kept the fight for justice alive for Kevin and Don. Now we're going to have a look at where Linda Ives' fight stands today. On August 24th, 2016, Linda Ives has sued the U.S. government's various agencies for violating the Freedom of Information Act with regards to withheld and redacted documents that might help bring resolution to her cause. The U.S. agencies named in the lawsuit are a who's who of the alphabet agencies that exist, including the CIA, the DEA, the DOJ, and so on, right down to the local Saline County area agencies. I have to ask if, in the words of the FBI to Linda Ives, there was no crime committed, then why are there so many agencies storing documents on the case that are classified, redacted, or otherwise deemed a threat to national security if released? Also, why is there still a fight to get these documents for Linda? It's been 29 long and painful years for the Ives and Henry families, as well as the other families who have lost loved ones over all of this. Why is the withholding of documents dragging on in a style reminiscent of the Kennedy assassination? At any rate, Linda Ives' current fight is to get proper custody of all the files involving the investigation of her son and get them in full, unredacted form, which she has every right to have, especially by now.
We didn't realize there was anybody else out there at first. We were just, like I said, goofing off. We come up on, or didn't really come up on, we noticed there were people on the track. Saw a flashlight come on and then go back off. They weren't looking in our direction, but we could see the light. And so we kind of quieted down and snuck up a little bit closer to see what was going on. And there was 5 individuals standing on the tracks. One thing that struck my curiosity is, at the time, my mother was dating an attorney named Dan Harmon. I knew him well enough to recognize him. There were 2 more individuals that a few minutes after we got there were walking down the railroad tracks that had a rifle and what looked to be a flashlight. And they were more or less kind of minding their own business. And when they realized someone else was on the tracks, they stopped and was fixing to turn around when someone or Danny motioned for them to come closer over to where they were. They hesitated and eventually ended up walking on towards the rest of the group. While my head was turned, I heard what sounded like a gunshot. I saw a flash, as you would expect with a gunshot at night. We were pretty much terrified and bolted and ran.
So would you say you're 100% sure?
That was 200% sure it was Danny Harmon, without any doubt.
Without any doubt.
Other witnesses corroborated that evidence.
I know that Dan Harmon went down there because I was down the road from there. It's in an automobile. I do know that a drop was made. I've absolutely 100% unequivocally made there that night.
The track that night, to my knowledge, were Dan Harmon, Keith McCaskill, Larry Rochelle.
One thing to know is that Linda Ives launched a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit on August 24th, 2016. And we're going to take a close look into a few of these documents, and you'll see why she launched the lawsuit. And we'll start with this one. And one thing to take note of is that I've taken the liberty to unredact a few of these documents based on what I know about the case. And in this instance, I'm 100% positive this is Charlene Wilson they're talking about. And it says, inasmuch as Wilson has provided information concerning this alleged cover-up, she was asked to take a polygraph. And the examiner's conclusions stated it is the opinion of the examiner that the examinee's responses to the relevant questions were not deceptive. And I want to point out as well, if you go over to the Investment Watch blog site, you should read this article, and here's the link for it. It's an excellent article chock full of information on the case, and in it they relate a KARK news story from August 12, 1999. And KARK is the local news channel for Little Rock since something like 1953 or something. And Kim Miller was the channel's news reporter doing the story. And what she said about Charlene Wilson is that Wilson says she cannot directly connect anyone with the murders of the boys, whose bodies were found on the railroad tracks. But she says she dropped then prosecutor Dan Harmon off near the tracks that night and waited while he went to pick up a drug drop. She says that when Harmon returned, he had blood on his pants, as if he had wiped his hands on them. But I noticed that makes 2 accountings now by Charlene Wilson, that she was in a car near the tracks that night, while she waited for Dan Harmon to do his business at the tracks.
I know that Dan Harmon went down there because I was down the road from there. It's in an automobile.
As far as Tommy Newhouse, I'm also quite positive that these couple of documents relate to his polygraphs when he came in to give his witness testimony. And this second one we'll come back to in a bit, as I found something rather interesting about it. Unfortunately, though, we'll never get the chance to ask Tommy Newhouse about what happened that night, as he passed away February 6, 2013, at the age of 36. Now, we know that Dan Harmon was appointed special prosecutor by Judge John Cole, and in this document we can see that the Little Rock FBI investigation reveals that Benton Chief of Police Rick Almendorf, Judge John Cole, and Dan Harmon were at Judge Cole's residence when Dan Harmon suggested that he be made special prosecutor for the Ives Henry case. So Harmon, who has been named by 3 people as being at the tracks and involved in the boys' killings, himself asked to be placed as the special prosecutor for the grand jury. Then it says, Since the beginning of the investigation by the special prosecutor, the case has become riddled with rumors and innuendos. Special Prosecutor Harmon and Assistant Richard Garrett requested assistance from the Arkansas State Police, yet continuously withheld information from them. A gag order was placed on the case, yet Little Rock FBI investigation reveals that the gag order was violated by Dan Harmon, who would release information to the press on a regular basis. Further, since the beginning of the FBI investigation, December 1993, numerous individuals interviewed have provided information alleging the involvement of Dan Harmon and another entity that's redacted under that long line, but their alleged involvement is in drug trafficking as well as involvement in the deaths of the captioned victims, which are Kevin and Don. And this too is another document that we're going to come back to. Moving along, here's an FBI document from February 1995, and in it states that it appears that the special prosecutor appointed in this case, and we know that's Dan Harmon, may have misused his authority and disregarded other leads that may have assisted efforts to bring this investigation to a logical conclusion. Lastly, it also appears that certain Saline County officials may have conspired to cover up the investigation into the deaths of Don Henry and Kevin Ives. And in this report, down at the bottom, it says, a systematic approach regarding the issuance of subpoenas has been discussed with the agreement of, and it says Dan Harmon under there, I'm pretty sure, being the first target. I also came across this newspaper clipping of an article from the same U.S. Attorney's investigation that was being run by Chuck Banks and Bob Govar. And in it says witnesses in an upcoming federal trial will testify that a Hot Springs man indicted on charges of conspiracy to distribute cocaine and marijuana had social ties to prosecutor Dan Harmon and his family. And in this 1991 article, we can see that Harmon was cleared of all allegations of drug crimes, cleared by U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Arkansas, Chuck Banks. And there was another officer long rumored to be at the scene that night, where Kevin and Don were killed. I've got it on good word that this document relates to Officer Danny Allen. And it says Danny Allen is alleged to have been involved in the murder of Ives and Henry. And on December 15th, 1994, Danny Allen was subpoenaed to the Little Rock office of the FBI to give hair and blood samples. Allen was asked to take a polygraph concerning his knowledge surrounding the deaths of Henry and Ives. And Danny Allen agreed to take a polygraph. And in the examiner's conclusions, we can see that it says it is the opinion of the examiner that the examinee was deceptive. During the post-test, Danny Allen maintained that he had absolutely nothing to do with the deaths of Kevin Ives or Don Henry. And he admitted that he did very little, if anything, to attempt to solve these murders. Then it goes on to say that Allen still continued to maintain his innocence about being involved in the murders of Henry and Ives. When told that he would not change the examiner's mind, Allen got up and walked out of the interview room and refused to talk with the interviewing agents any further. During the pre-test phase of the polygraph examination, Allen was asked why he was in the room and stated that he was there because he was stupid enough to have agreed to take a polygraph. And in this FBI document dated December 22, 1994, and if we remove a bunch of the redactions, we can see that it says, for information of Little Rock, Danny Allen was polygraphed regarding knowledge of captioned case on Thursday, December 15, 1994, which is the same date as the document we just looked at, so we know it's the same person, Danny Allen. And skipping down below, on the polygraph, Allen was asked specific questions regarding the captioned subject's deaths. Although Allen proclaimed that he knew nothing, the results of his polygraph clearly indicated deception. Special Agent Redacted reported that Allen indicated strong deception regarding knowledge of who killed the boys as well as who put the boys on the tracks, which is something I brought up in my other video, Murder on the Tracks, in that statement is very indicative of two separate entities involved in the murders of Kevin and Don. One entity involved in the murders, while the other entity involved in putting them on the tracks. And according to Billy Jack Haynes' statement, it was Kirk Lane and Jay Campbell who killed the boys, and Dan Harmon and Richard Garrett and Billy Jack Haynes who put them on the tracks. It's little details like this that I believe makes Haynes' statements much more plausible. Anyways, it further goes on to say, Danny Allen did advise Special Agent Redacted that he believed, and I'm pretty sure under this redaction it said Special Prosecutor Dan Harmon, to be involved in the deaths of the boys. And this too is another document that we're going to come back to shortly. But as we can see, there's all kinds of documents that name Dan Harmon in relation to the boys, and in relation to their murders, in relation to drugs as well. And I've only showed you just a few. And here's another example where we see Prosecutor Dan Harmon, though we're not allowed to know in relation to what it is, except for that a confidential witness said something about it. And as time would go on, Harmon's nefarious ways would finally catch up with him, such as threatening to kill his wife, as can be seen by this newspaper article. And in 1996, Harmon would finally get busted, and ultimately he'd be charged with 11 felonies, 5 of which he was convicted for, including racketeering and drug charges. But of course, in any of these trials, none of the stuff we've looked at was brought up, and they didn't look into any of his possible involvement with the murders of Kevin and Don. It's as if the stuff we just looked at, which was just the sample, never even existed.
Dan Harmon stood accused of stealing drugs from his drug task force, putting them back on the street, and cutting deals with drug suspects for money and sexual favors. At the end of his trial, he left the federal courthouse guilty on 5 of 11 charges, the most serious racketeering. The name Dan Harmon first came to light in 1988. Harmon was a county prosecutor taking on one of the biggest murder cases in the state's history. The deaths of Kevin Ives and Don Henry, 2 teenagers found dead on a railroad track in Saline County. Harmon resurfaced 3 years later when he was slapped with 4 federal charges for tax evasion. Harmon was subsequently thrown in jail for refusing to take a drug test. After 19 days behind bars and an appeals court hearing, he was freed from his first stint behind bars. His freedom continued until July of 1992, when Harmon was found guilty of not filing a tax return for 1988. He was then fined $25 and sentenced to 2 weeks home detention. Harmon hit headlines once again when 4 bricks of fake cocaine were found in his ex-wife's apartment. The bricks were evidence belonging to Harmon's 7th District Drug Task Force. 3 months later, Harmon's ex-wife, Holly Duvall, accused him of kidnapping and assaulting her. He was jailed again, and this time refused to leave in the hope of getting a speedy trial. It was during this time period he began a hunger strike in jail, underwent a psychiatric evaluation, and even shaved his head. Throughout this time in the spotlight, Harmon often criticized the media and even hit an Arkansas Democrat Gazette reporter. Later that month, he negotiated a plea arrangement. Several of his charges, from kidnapping to disorderly conduct, were reduced in exchange for his resignation from office. That day came in July of 1996, as Dan Harmon cleared his office and moved to the Gulf.
Accused of racketeering and drug offenses, is a free man today. Harmon was released from federal custody yesterday while he awaits his trial. You may remember just last Thursday, Harmon was jailed after refusing to take drug tests. However, during a court hearing yesterday, he told a federal magistrate he would submit to those tests. Harmon maintains his innocence and says he is a victim of government harassment.
Sir Dan Harmon got out of jail yesterday. A federal grand jury indicted Harmon on 11 counts. He ended up jailed after he refused a drug test, a condition of his freedom until trial.
After 15 hours of deliberations, a federal jury found the former 7th District prosecutor guilty on 5 of 11 felony charges.
After 2 days of deliberations, the jury found Harmon guilty of 5 of 11 counts, guilty of drug charges, racketeering, and extortion.
Every one of those counts that they convicted me of extortion of, every bit of that money went to where it was supposed to go. If they can stick some garbage like this on me, then every American better be scared to death.
Yeah. Meanwhile, after serving 9 years of a 10-year sentence, Harmon would get arrested again in 2010 for selling drugs.
It is tonight's top story. Police say the 6-month investigation that landed Harmon behind bars also led to the arrest of a dozen other people in Grant County.
Anybody sell drugs is a threat to the public.
Former Saline County prosecutor Dan Harmon is back behind bars, barely 4 years after serving time for extortion, racketeering, and drug conspiracy from a 1997 conviction.
If he thinks that he's going to be able to do it because of his status as being a former prosecutor, he's wrong. It's not going to happen here.
Harmon is among the last few alleged drug dealers taken off Sheridan streets after a 6-month investigation. Harmon lives in Saline County, but the investigation led police here to a traffic stop. Police say they found several drug items in his car. Harmon's passenger, a well-known drug dealer, is also now helping authorities. Assistant Chief Brent Cole says the former prosecutor is facing several felony charges that could land him in prison, this time for life.
Dealing drugs near his school. What a piece of work. And that's literal, as purportedly he was selling them right out of his car. I wonder how many lives of young people this guy's actually ruined. So let's have a look at Dan Harmon's good friend, sidekick, and deputy prosecutor, Richard Garrett.
We certainly don't have any suspects that has this point in time. It's been quite a while, and I really didn't anticipate that it would take this long when we first started. I'm frustrated in the amount of time that it's taken. Frustrated that we weren't able to accomplish some things we probably should have been able to. Whatever comes out of it, if someone's charged or not charged, the grand jury has done a tremendous job.
But it still will leave the open question if the boys were murdered, who did it?
Well, until it's solved, that's correct.
So in going back to those documents that I said we'll come back to, here's the first one. And going down near the bottom, it says Deputy Prosecuting Attorney Richard Garrett was requesting that individuals with tips on captioned victims' deaths call in information. And then on this 1994 FBI document that we already seen concerning Officer Danny Allen, we can see that they say Unsolved Mysteries is currently running an old film clip, which was made shortly after the boys' deaths. And the clip they're talking about originally aired on October 12, 1988, a little over a year after the boys were murdered. And it goes on to say, featured on the tape are Danny Allen, Richard Garrett, and Curtis Henry. And that's the film clip, or tape, as we just saw in the other document, where Richard Garrett was requesting that individuals with tips call in. Then it further goes on to say, in light of a possible law enforcement cover-up, it is requested that the FBI remake a tape on Unsolved Mysteries to replace the current tape running. Now, why would they request that? What was happening between October 12, 1988, when Richard Garrett was requesting people to call in, and December 22, 1994, when the FBI mentions a possible law enforcement cover-up and requests a remake on the Unsolved Mysteries tape to be made? So what was happening between that time frame? Well, we can see here that Keith McCaskill was murdered. He was murdered on November 11, 1988. And don't forget that both Billy Jack Haynes and Charlene Wilson have named Keith McCaskill as being on the tracks that night. Then there's Greg Collins, and Greg Collins was subpoenaed by the grand jury to testify in regard to the deaths of Ives and Henry. Prior to his testifying, Collins was murdered, and he was murdered in January of 1989. The same document mentions Keith Coney, who was murdered in July 1988, but that was 5 months before the October 12, 1988 airing of Unsolved Mysteries, where Richard Garrett was asking for witnesses to call in. And Keith Coney was the guy in the motorcycle, identified in numerous reports as being with Kevin and Don that night. But in going back to the time frame after Richard Garrett's appearance on Unsolved Mysteries, we can see that Jeff Rhodes was also murdered in April of 1989. And he just so happened to be a good friend of Greg Collins, who we just saw was murdered in January of 1989. And then there's the setup death of Richard Winters, who I don't happen to have a photo of, but he was murdered in July of 1989. And in all, there were at least 6 murders with links to Kevin and Don's murders, and the bulk of them happened between October 12, 1988, when Richard Garrett was on Unsolved Mysteries asking for people to call in, and December 22, 1994, when the FBI wanted to remake the Unsolved Mysteries tape to replace the old one, in light of a possible cover-up by law enforcement. And not only that, but there's more. Here's the FBI document we looked at about Tommy Newhouse's polygraph. And I just happened to find another version of the document that you can tell was rewritten, but it has far less redactions. And when you put them side by side, you can see that the body of the document has been changed, though the context is still the same. But we can see that the first paragraph has been completely unredacted now. And let's have a look at what it says. And it says, after this murder was aired on Unsolved Mysteries, and this is the October 12, 1988 show they're talking about, and after that show, Harmon put Richard Garrett in charge of all leads. Individuals would call in with information, and a formal statement was never taken. The individual would then be threatened by telephone to keep his or her mouth shut. So would this be one of the reasons that the FBI requested a remake on the tape of the Unsolved Mystery shows? Seems like it might be a likely conclusion to me. And there were other witnesses in the case too, as we can see by this document, though we don't know who. But this person may have knowledge of who is responsible for the deaths of Don Henry and Kevin Ives. And in this same document I noticed where it says Dan Harmon enlisted the help of the Arkansas State Police. And I'm reminded that in this document it says Harmon and Richard Garrett requested assistance from the Arkansas State Police, yet continuously withheld information from them. Here's another document where we see the names of a couple of murdered witnesses that we already had a look at, and a couple more names that we haven't seen. And somehow, all these murdered people are tied into Kevin and Don's murders. And here's another document of a witness, who again we don't know, who alleges to have information regarding Keith McCaskill, who as we know was knifed and killed. And let's have a listen to what Richard Garrett has to say about Keith McCaskill.
I think that Mr. McCaskill was probably suffering from a lot of paranoia. And right now the indications are that Nobody else was involved.
Might there have been a reason, though, for his paranoia?
I'm sure there was a reason for his paranoia.
Because he talked to the police or the prosecutor?
I don't know that would be the reason.
And did you catch that? Smile and all.
Paranoia?
I'm sure there was a reason for his paranoia.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that Keith McCaskill had a good reason for some paranoia as well. Now we'll have a look at Kirk Lane and Jay Campbell. And there's documents from two different witnesses that relate the same story, that what appears to be Kirk Lane and Jay Campbell beat Kevin and Don unconscious at the grocery store and threw them in the back of the car and took them back to the tracks, which also fits into the accounting of what Billy Jack Haynes says. So in this Arkansas State Police document, dated June 20th, 1988, we can see they did an interview of witness Ronnie Godwin. And in it, we can see that Mr. Godwin was interviewed by this investigator, who was Sergeant Barney Phillips, along with Deputy Prosecuting Attorney Richard Garrett. Go figure. Godwin stated last August, either on a Sunday night or a Saturday night, he observed a police car that was gray in color with 3 antennas on the trunk by the grocery store as he was driving by. And he says there were a couple of officers pushing a subject up against the telephone booth. I pulled off the road by some tracks and watched. There was a subject laying on the ground, not moving, and another officer was standing off to the side of the car. And further, he says, as I stopped my car, I saw them pick the boy up off the ground and throw him into the back seat. After putting the boys into the back seat of the car, they drove off up to the top of the mountain. In about 3 to 5 minutes, they came back down and drove past where I was sitting. I did not see the boys in the car at this time, just a grocery or a garbage bag sitting in the back seat. And then, 3 days later, another Arkansas State Police officer did an interview of Ronnie Godwin on June 23, 1988. And Officer Dale Swezzy says, Godwin gave me the following information concerning what an anonymous caller reported to the state police as information concerning the deaths of 2 boys on the railway track at Benton. And just to note, Godwin was incarcerated at the time of these interviews, but he was relaying what happened almost a year earlier when he left Gigi's nightclub and was traveling home. And when Godwin left Gigi's and was traveling home, he saw 2 men he believed to be police officers, 2 teenage boys, and what he believed to be an unmarked police car. He estimated the time at approximately 2:30 a.m. He described the vehicle as a gray plain car. He said the car had police hubcaps, 3 antennas on the trunk, and a spotlight on the side. One of the men was seen pushing a teenaged white male against a phone booth. Another teenager was kneeling on the ground between the phone booth and the police car. A second man, Godwin believed to be a police officer, also was standing over the teenage boy kneeling on the ground. Godwin proceeded south on Highway 111, past Shoal Road, and pulled into a trailer lot just south of the Miller's Grocery parking lot, which I believe was one and the same as the Ranchette grocery store. Godwin watched as the man in the white shirt pushed the boy against the phone booth several times, and both men loaded the 2 boys into the backseat of the car. Godwin said the car went up the road and apparently did not turn off until it went over the crest of a hill. Godwin said the car came back approximately 5 or 10 minutes later. He said as the car passed, he noticed a bag, he believed to be a garbage bag, in the back seat of the car. Godwin provided information by drawing a map, location of his vehicle, and the location of the grocery store, and the phone booth. A compilation of the information will be provided on a diagram attached to this report. And here's that compilation diagram. And if you'll note, the diagram is composed from information provided by Ronnie Godwin. It was done by the Arkansas State Police. And it's an accounting of Ronnie Godwin's statement of him traveling south on Highway 111. And as he was driving by, he noticed an altercation between what appeared to be 2 police and 2 teenagers, which prompted him to duck into a trailer parking lot and watch what happened. And here's a zoom in of that drawing if you want to see the details of what Godwin was reporting. In the location of the telephone booth, where the larger man with the white shirt was pushing the boy against. And just to translate that hand-drawn map into something more real, we can look at the Ranchette grocery store and the property it's on and what it looks like today. And we can see the corner probably looks pretty much the same as it did back then. And there's the store. And this would be the area where one of the boys is reportedly being pushed against the phone booth, with X marking the spot of where the phone booth was. And sadly, this would be the location where Kevin Ives and Don Henry would encounter the beginning of their brutal and horrific murders. And something else I noticed, swinging around and having a look from a different angle, this was the probable location of the phone booth. Now, I don't know how many years ago the phone booth was taken away from that corner, but you notice the grass hasn't taken color. almost like a refusal to conform, in defiance, in the memory of Kevin and Don. And now we'll take a look at another Arkansas State Police witness statement document taken on February 22, 1990, almost 2 years after Ronnie Godwin's statements. And in an interview of Mike Crook, he related that the morning the two boys' bodies were found, a guy he only knows as Jerry came by and told him that late last night he was sitting across from the Ranchac grocery store when two boys walked up, and one boy rode up on a motorcycle, and that would be Keith Coney. Crook states that the boy in the motorcycle rode off, and then an unmarked police car pulled up, and two men in plain clothes got out, and Jerry said one of them was Kirk Lane. Crook states that the boys and these two cops got into an argument, and the two cops beat the boys unconscious and threw them into the car, and then drove off. And that would be the accounting of what Jerry told Crook, who was relaying this to the Arkansas State Police, 2 years after Ronnie Godwin's matching accounts of the same situation. But Crook states that before Keith McCaskill was killed, McCaskill told him that Kirk Lane and Jay Campbell were following him around, and he, being Keith McCaskill, was afraid they were going to kill him. Crook also states that after McCaskill was killed, Lane and Campbell shot up his house one night. He states that his son was at the club, and someone called and said McCaskill is dead, and you are next. And then later, shots were fired into his house, and when he looked out, he saw the Camaro that Kirk Lane drives. And here's an FBI document dated November 30th, 1994, and it's another one that I'll unredact, as we know who it is, and it pertains to Mike Crook again. And it says, two males from the patrol car began beating the boys, and then threw the boys in the back of the patrol car and took off. Crook believed this guy to be a drunk and basically ignored him, and this is Jerry they're talking about. But then they say, Crook became aware of the deaths of Henry and Ives the next morning, at which time he thought there may be some credence to the man's story. So that makes two witnesses, independent of each other, who don't know each other, both saying the same thing, that they saw two police officers beating up two boys at the grocery store, and one of those witnesses named Kirk Lane as being one of those officers. And there's also accounts of a third witness, naming the police as the ones who killed Kevin and Don, and that would be the boy in the motorcycle, who himself would be murdered less than a year after Kevin and Don, and his accounts would be relayed through his parents. Here's his mother explaining that Keith Coney knew that it was two men that had killed Kevin and Don.
And I don't think it was an accident because he was fearing for his life, a couple of months before. He said a couple of times that he knew people, that he was being watched, and he was afraid.
Mrs. Alexander says her son knew the two teenagers run over by the train, and she says he indicated to her he had been there when the boys had died, that he spotted two attackers.
But he knew there was two there. I did try to get him to tell me who, and he was either afraid or didn't know.
So all Keith Coney would tell his mom was that he knew it was two men that killed Kevin and Don, and that he was fearing for his life, and rightfully so. And if we have a look over here at the idfiles.com website, an excellent site created by Linda Ives and Gene Duffy, we can see that another state police report would have corroborated Crook's statement, and that's Mike Crook, who we just looked at. But it would have corroborated Crook's statement about a third boy if pursued, but it wasn't. A December 8th, 1988 interview is of Joseph Clark Farmer, a friend of Eugene and Keith Coney, Eugene being Keith's father. Farmer said he was talking to Eugene Coney about the two boys not long after they were killed. And Eugene said, Keith said the cops killed the boys. So while Keith Coney wouldn't or couldn't tell his mother who killed Kevin and Don, other than it was two men, he apparently did tell his father it was the cops, which matches the statements given by Ronnie Godwin and Mike Crook and now Billy Jack Haynes as well. And that's not all. There's also this October 12, 1988 Arkansas State Police document that details a tip given in naming Kirk Lane as one of the killers. It says there are physical descriptions following each name, and they say there's an asterisk beside the name of Kirk Lane and Jay Campbell, denoting them as most dangerous. Beside the name of Kirk Lane, there is the notation, kill the Bryant children being investigated. After a physical description of Jay Campbell, there is the notation, told Donna he would rape her and her mother, and illegible, her dog. A photostatic copy, or a photocopy, of this paper will be attached to this report, and we have that copy. And also, when Lane and Campbell sued filmmaker Pat Matriciana and lost the case on appeal, here's what the appeal court had to say about them. All in all, statements and rumors corroborating the Lane Campbell scenario or implicating them as suspects emanate in varying degrees of detail from multiple sources. And law enforcement records, which were available to the public through Freedom of Information devices, revealed that purported eyewitnesses implicated law enforcement officers in the deaths of the Ives and Henry boys, including the appellees, Lane and Campbell. The plaintiffs, Lane and Campbell, could not show that the statement was false, the statement being that they were implicated in the murders of Kevin and Don. So what happened to Kirk Lane and Jay Campbell? Well, as we can see here, in February 2006, Jay Campbell and his wife were arrested on drugs and sex charges. Arrested on Monday were Ronald J. Campbell, the now former Lone Oak police chief, who faces multiple felony charges relating to drug and theft allegations, just like Dan Harmon. He was convicted and sentenced, and we can see here from his appeal on October 4th, 2007, that a judgment and a commitment order entered April 24th, 2007, indicates that a jury convicted appellant Ronald J. Campbell of 28 charges. The appellant, J. Campbell, was sentenced to an aggregate, or combined, term of 480 months, or 40 years, imprisonment in the Arkansas Department of Correction. So a month later, on November 5th, 2009, the Supreme Court of Arkansas made a decision on J. Campbell's appeal. And after all the explanation, they say the circuit court erred in failing to grant Campbell's motion to suppress evidence seized in the execution of the search warrant, and the ruling of the Supreme Court of Arkansas on J. Campbell's appeal reversed and remanded. The state Supreme Court reversed former Lone Oak Police Chief Jay Campbell's convictions for running a continuing criminal enterprise, and though he has since been released on bond, he would still be awaiting trial for drugs and theft. And from this article posted on January 28, 2014, on Arkansas Online, we can see that Jay Campbell's wife, after getting out of prison, gets busted again. And as for Jay Campbell, as we just saw, the Arkansas Supreme Court in November 2009 tossed out his conviction, and he was sentenced in February 2010 to 15 years in prison. And as for Kirk Lane, we can see that by 2009, he became the chief of police of Benton. He would then quit as the Benton police chief in July 2017 and take the job of Arkansas's drug director of all things. And how did he land that job? Well, Governor Asa Hutchinson had announced Kirk Lane, chief of police for the Benton Police Department, as the new Arkansas drug director. The very same Asa Hutchinson who, as U.S. attorney, blocked investigations by law enforcement into Barry Seal. So, in going back to Linda Ives' Freedom of Information lawsuit, the current status of it, as of February 2018, is that the government is trying to get the case thrown out on grounds that it's a still ongoing investigation. The lawsuit itself isn't bringing anybody to trial. The lawsuit's about getting these files unredacted, so Linda might finally be able to find out what actually happened to her son. And as far as an ongoing investigation, and for people to question why does Linda Ives have a private investigator, why doesn't she go to the police, which should be quite obvious by now. But here's the current Saline County Sheriff, Rodney Wright, and guess who he happens to be? Dan Harmon's nephew. So how much actual investigating is being done? It's been 30 years, going on 31. And it's not like Rodney Wright's predecessors were doing anything about it either, as both Bruce Pennington and Mike Frost themselves would end up going to jail too for their own corruption, showing how much time they dedicated to the Ives and Henry case. And all Linda wants out of this lawsuit at this time is access to files such as these. An FBI document dated May 9, 1995, relating to Keith McCaskill. But 23 years later, we're still not allowed to know who, other than it's a Pulaski County narcotics person, and another individual is also mentioned in these pages as an individual who is following Keith McCaskill. But if we go back and look at Mike Crook's statements, we can see that Mike Crook states that before Keith McCaskill was killed, McCaskill told him that Kirk Lane and Jay Campbell of the Pulaski County Sheriff's Office were following him around. What a coincidence. And McCaskill also told Crook that he was afraid that Kirk Lane and Jay Campbell were going to kill him. Now, with everything we know about the case, is it possible that underneath these redactions are the names Jay Campbell and Kirk Lane? As I said, 23 years after this report was written, we still don't know because it looks like this. How about this FBI report that says law enforcement officials alleged to be involved in drug trafficking in Saline County include, and everything's all blocked out. Or here's another FBI report that says, the Little Rock Division has been gathering intelligence on current political corruption in Saline County, which will parallel the corruption resulting in captioned victims' deaths. And the captioned victims were Kevin and Don. And of course, current intelligence tells us absolutely nothing. And this detailed FBI report tells us exactly the same. There's this Arkansas State Police report from December 8, 1988, talking about evidence in Kevin and Don's case, say that cigarettes were at one time in the evidence room at the sheriff's office, but he could not say if they were still there or not. And this is 1988. He states that the evidence has changed hands so much that he had given up on trying to keep it all together. And in this FBI document, we can see that evidence from this case, to include a sketch of the accident scene, cigarette butts left at the accident site, pictures of the crime scene, plus the original case file, are missing. And all these areas are still blacked out. And this FBI report from December 18, 1993 says, Saline County officials are baffled that some of the original evidence collected during 1987 is no longer available, and that files are missing. And a year later, in this FBI document from August 24, 1994, we can see that somebody furnished a box of evidence which was found stuck away in a locker. Then it says attached to this memo is a copy of an internal U.S. Attorney memo written from U.S. Attorney Redacted to U.S. Attorney Chuck Banks. And that would be the same Chuck Banks who in 1991 cleared Dan Harmon and all the other Saline officials of any wrongdoing in all the drug and corruption charges. And of course, like all the other documents, there's huge redactions, leaving us with nothing but questions. And then in this document, the following year, on March 2nd, 1995, we see that U.S. Attorney Robert Govar supplied Little Rock Division with 3 boxes of grand jury material pertaining to captioned investigation, as well as corruption in Saline County. And if you remember from my movie Murder on the Tracks, you'll remember that Bob Govar was the assistant U.S. Attorney to U.S. Attorney Chuck Banks, who closed down the investigations on Dan Harmon. And if we fast forward Bob Govar's future, we find out that he would end up working with none other than Jay Campbell. From an article in the Arkansas Leader in 2008, we can see that Govar was demoted the previous year after making threats to that columnist for suggesting Govar must have known that he was illegally using prison labor on his property in Lone Oak. The prison labor, you recall, was provided by Jay Campbell, the former Lone Oak police chief who was sentenced to 40 years in prison on corruption charges. And Govar testified at the Campbell's trial that he didn't know he was breaking the law when he used prison labor. And what did Govar say about Jay Campbell at his trial? As we can see from the Arkansas Times, Robert Govar held Campbell, Jay Campbell, in high regard, and furthers that by saying, I thought he was an excellent drug investigator. I bet he did. It seems they're all quite connected rather well. Some fall through the cracks and end up in jail, but the overall cover-up of the 1980s continues on. And speaking of cover-ups, here's the FBI burying Kevin and Don's case. They say, while there are indications of misconduct within the Saline County criminal justice system, these have not developed into offenses that warrant further federal investigation into the deaths of Ives and Henry. Based on the foregoing, it is my recommendation that the FBI conduct no further investigation into this matter. And that's that, which I find to be incredibly unbelievable. You just have to look at the original autopsy results that were overturned to easily see why an investigation is warranted. And let's go back and have a look at the beginning of the cover-up, starting with the autopsy and who it was performed by. Meet Family Malik, the Arkansas State Medical Examiner, and he did the first autopsy on Kevin and Don, and he ruled that they smoked 20 pot joints and fell asleep and didn't hear the train bearing down on them.
Media coverage of Malik's dishonest rulings resulted in a massive public outcry, calling for his removal from office.
The medical examiner comes up and he has fabrication to where he has created his own evidence.
This is of a magnitude it could create a national scandal, and if necessary, it will.
I have work to do.
You know me.
I have work to do.
Yes, you can say that you are honest.
Lying on his autopsy cases, lying in court. And he's not an honest person.
That's why he should be prosecuted.
He should be prosecuted.
Was there stabbed? The answer is no, they were not stabbed. Were they dead beforehand? Absolutely no, they were alive.
A former employee at the crime lab has said he discovered what appeared to be evidence of a stab wound during the original autopsy, but was told, quote, not to worry about it. Malik has refused all comment.
Sir, I told you before, like our president said, read my lips. I'm not going to comment.
In an exclusive interview, Dr. Fahmy Malik defended his record.
I never lied. Never. Never.
But not all of Malik's former co-workers hold the same confidence. Philip Kaplan represents Malik's former assistant, Dr. Lee Beamer. Beamer is suing Malik for allegedly firing him without proper cause. Beamer previously revealed that Malik testified about autopsies he never conducted.
Dr. Malik refused repeated requests to talk with us. But when we caught up with him, he said people didn't like him because he's from Egypt. And he claimed he had never made a single mistake in any of the 7,000 autopsies he conducted.
People say that as the state medical examiner, you were incompetent and you bungled cases, and that Governor Clinton, for some reason, defended you and protected you. Is that the case?
You have to understand, they did 7,000 autopsies. Not one single case overturned because of me.
Not a single case?
Not one single case.
But that's just not true.
And of course it's not true. As we've seen with Kevin and Don's case, a grand jury overruled Malik. The boys had been murdered. Dr. Joseph Burton of Atlanta and a team of pathologists were called in, and they exhumed the bodies of Kevin and Don and performed another autopsy, and discovered that Don had been knifed in the back, and Kevin's skull had been crushed with a blunt object.
This information alone would strongly suggest that the boys were injured, rendered unconscious, or even killed prior to their bodies being run over by the train. The deaths of these two boys most probably were not accidental deaths, but that they met their death as a result of injuries inflicted on them by other people or another person.
And you'd be right in wondering why anybody would be defending Malik, and not only defending him, but pushing for raises for him, including Bill Clinton. And maybe this 4-page article from the Los Angeles Times, published on May 19, 1992, has the answer. It states, Governor Bill Clinton, the presumptive Democratic presidential nominee, refused for several years to dismiss a state medical examiner whose controversial decrees included a ruling that helped Clinton's mother, a nurse, avoid scrutiny in the death of a patient. The medical examiner, Dr. Fahmy Malik, was sort of protected by the governor in the State Crime Laboratory Board, said Representative Bob Fairchild. Clinton, Malik, and Clinton's mother, Virginia Dwyer Kelly, 68, deny any connection between Malik's longevity in his job and his ruling involving Kelly. The record shows that Malik testified erroneously in criminal cases, and in one instance he misread a medical chart and wrongly accused the deputy county coroner of killing someone. And in another, he based court testimony on tissue samples that DNA tests later indicated had been mixed up with other tissue samples. 3 weeks before Clinton announced his presidential candidacy, he pushed Malik to resign. But then, the Clinton administration found Malik another well-paying job in state government. It prompted renewed questions about a conflict of interest growing out of Malik's ruling in 1981 that involved Clinton's mother. Clinton, in a written statement to the Times, responded, "There has never been any connection between my mother's professional experiences and action I have taken or not taken as governor of Arkansas, and I resent any implication otherwise. In fact, it was several years after the incident that I became aware that the ruling made by Dr. Malik in this case was controversial, and we're just supposed to believe him and take his word for it. This is the same guy that brought us this."
It depends upon what the meaning of the word is.
Yes.
Anyways, the case involving Bill Clinton's mother was hardly the only Malik ruling to come under serious question. Over the years, his rulings and his testimony became controversial, and more than 20 additional deaths. Some of Malik's controversial rulings include the Albright case, where Malik ruled his death a suicide. But Albright had been shot 5 times. All 5 shots were in the chest. Then the Times goes on to talk about the Ives Henry case and remind us that Malik ruled that they had been smoking marijuana and dozed off, and had slept as the onrushing freight train bore down. But a second autopsy indicated that Henry had been stabbed in the back, and Ives had been struck on the skull, and that both boys had probably been placed on the tracks unconscious, maybe already dead. Malik's attorney says, Dr. Malik has said he doesn't believe anybody laid a finger on those boys. After a grand jury overruled Malik in the Ives Henry case, Clinton hired 2 out-of-state pathologists to review Malik's performance. They gave him high marks and said he should get a raise. But the visiting pathologists were paid $20,000 from Clinton's discretionary fund. And let's not forget,
Clinton said he offered $25,000 to Prosecutor Black's boss to fund a grand jury.
I believe Bill Clinton's an honest, respectable man, and I have to believe that he did that. But the fact is, I never got that.
So Clinton, by all appearances, wouldn't give a cent to help the investigations into the mountains of cocaine that were pouring into Arkansas. But he would pay visiting pathologists $20,000 to give Fahmy Malak high marks and suggest that he get a raise. And 2 months after the pathologist visit, as we've seen, Clinton sent a proposal to the legislature to raise Malak's salary by 41%. At hearings on the proposed pay raise, Linda Ives, mother of Kevin Ives, and others who felt wronged by Malak's decisions began exchanging phone numbers. They formed an organization, Victims of Malak's Incredible Testimony, or VOMIT. For 3 years, VOMIT says, Clinton's staff has refused to let it present the petitions to the governor. Clinton's continued inaction caused suspicions about his motives. And when they're talking about the case with his mother in 1981, they're talking about an incident that happened at around 4:15 a.m., in which Billy Ray Washington, a black man, and his wife were walking home from a bar. And a car full of whites drove by, and someone in the car shouted racial epithets at the black couple. Then, Washington says, someone in the car threw a beer can at him. In response, he says, he threw a chunk of concrete. So anyways, the chunk of concrete went through the window and hit the face of Susan Deere, a 17-year-old single mother, and she was taken to the hospital. She was hit in the face just a little after 4:30 in the morning, and she wouldn't be taken into the operating room until 9 a.m. And by all accounts, other than some scarring, she was fine. She was stable, vital signs were excellent, blood pressure stable, no abnormalities of the cardiac rhythm, and in fact her parents were repeatedly told by nurses entering and leaving the operating room that Susie was doing fine and would be out of surgery in a little while. Then, the nurses stopped coming out, and the next thing they knew, they were told that she was dead. It was not until 3 hours into the surgery that Deere's condition grew critical, medical records show. Clinton's mother, Virginia Dwyer Kelly, was her nurse anesthetist. The records show that Deere's doctors asked Kelly to transfer oxygen tubes from her nose to her throat so they could proceed with no surgery, and that Kelly had difficulty with the transfer. After she had taken the tubes out of Deere's nose, she was not able to insert them into her throat, the records show. The records show that Dr. James Griffin, an ear, nose, and throat specialist, took over and inserted them for her. The records do not show how long Deere was without oxygen, but immediately following the reintubation of the patient orally, she developed bradycardia, and within a matter of seconds, she went into complete cardiac arrest. Malik performed an autopsy on Deere. He said her death was caused by blunt trauma and laid it at the hands of the person who threw the chunk of concrete that hit her. He called it a homicide. Dr. Griffin gave a few reasons why Malik's conclusions were premature, including saying that the cause of the initial cardiac arrest is not known at this time. And at the time of Deere's death, Kelly, Clinton's mother, was being sued in another case involving the death of another young mother, also from a lack of oxygen following minor elective surgery. So the LA Times goes on to say, if Malik had raised questions about Kelly in his autopsy in the Deere case, it might have complicated her already existing legal problems. Ultimately, Dr. Jocelyn Alders, director of the department, Fahmy Malik's boss, hired Malik within days as a $70,000 a year consultant. But if Malik, or Clinton, thought that the resignation would end the controversy, they were mistaken, and they were, as we're still talking about it. And the article goes on to say that on Malik's first day at his new job, the $70,000 a year one, members of VOMIT showed up in protest, and one of the signs they held up said, Clinton for president, Malik for general surgeon? And remember, this article was May 19th, 1992, 6 months before the election, and they wouldn't realize how close they were. When Clinton won the election, he took Jocelyn Alders to the White House with him and made her Surgeon General.
Based on the facts I have, I really feel that Arkansas owes Dr. Malik a great debt and a real apology.
To Today, the governor was asked if Malik should resign.
I don't think that's a decision that I should make based on what I now know.